You found the Backup Wrap-Up, your go-to podcast for all things backup, recovery, and cyber recovery. In this episode, we're talking about living off the land attacks. And it's honestly, I think, one of the sneakiest things that bad guys do. They get into your environment, and instead of bringing their own tools because, they might trip your alarm systems, they use your tools against you. Things like PowerShell or WMI, tools that you're likely already using. My co-author, Dr. Mike Saylor, breaks down how this works, why it's so hard to detect, and what you can actually do about it. I think there's a lot of value in this episode. By the way, if you don't know who I am, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup. And I've been passionate about backup and recovery for over, can't believe it, 30 years. Ever since I had to tell my boss there were no backups of the production database that we had just lost. I don't want that to happen to you, and that's why I do this. On this podcast, we turn unappreciated admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Hi folks, wanted to mention my new book, Learning Ransomware Response and Recovery, which is now available for pre-order at Amazon.com. I wrote it with my co-author, Dr. Mike Saylor, who's a blue team cyber defense expert. He really knows his stuff. There are dozens of books to tell you how not to get ransomware. Our book starts with the assumption you're probably going to get ransomware. So we tell you how to respond to it and how to recover from it. It's unlike anything else out there. We tell you what you need to do now to be able to respond when it happens. We covered defenses to reduce the blast radius, how to protect your backup system, incident response procedures, negotiation strategies, backup recovery techniques, and how to prevent it from happening again. The tech reviewers gave it overwhelmingly positive feedback, so I think it's going to be a big seller. Pre-order it now. Search for Learning Ransomware Response and Recovery, or just look for my name, W. Curtis Preston. Hope you like it. Welcome to the Backup Wrap-Up. I'm your host, W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup, and I have with me a guy who seems to laugh at my errors, Prasanna Malaiyandi. How's it going, Prasanna?
I'm good, Curtis. Nothing like with friends like this, who needs enemies?
Exactly. I make mistakes, and honestly, I like them too. It makes me laugh. Makes me laugh. It's just funny that how long has it been called the Backup Wrap-Up? At least 2 years now.
I think about probably 2 years.
Yeah, and my brain wants to say Backup Central's Restore It All, which is the original name of the podcast. But anyway, I don't know. Well, welcome to our pity party, Mike. Dr. Mike Saylor, how's it going?
It's going well, guys. Thanks for having me.
My co-author on our lovely book, Learning Ransomware Response and Recovery, which, Mike, I understand you have something to show us. You don't have it hung yet, but there he is, the official framed copy of our book. Just hold it just like that for the next
the entire time.
Yeah, O'Reilly does that. They send you a copy when when it's ready. And by the way, I just got news from one of my folks on LinkedIn that the book said it's going to be there on Tuesday. So that they ordered it in January, and Amazon says it's going to be there Tuesday. So very exciting.
So for all our listeners, go out, order the book, listen, or then you can actually read what Curtis and Mike have been doing for many, 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 many months.
Many months. And then give us a review on Amazon. If you like.
And then come back to the podcast because we will be going more in depth into many of these topics.
Yes, we will. And today we're talking about something that honestly I had heard the term, but it wasn't, given that I don't live that side of it the way you do, Mike. This term living off land was something new to me. So why don't you give us, do you have a story that kind of gives us an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about living off the land?
Well, there's lots of stories. but living off the land is often part of some bigger campaign, bigger attack, something you hear about in the news. Somebody got hacked, somebody had ransomware, somebody lost a bunch of data. Now, the living off the land part of that was simply something that facilitated that attack to some degree. So, and from as an auditor, an IT person, cyber person, I harp on organizations all the time. Whatever you build, make it focused on whatever it's doing. And so, the other term for that is system hardening. Delete things you don't need, turn stuff off you're not going to use, close the port, don't talk to things that you don't need to talk to. Those are all fruits of the land that a bad guy could use to facilitate an attack. Some of those you can't turn off, like Windows management as an example, or WMI. The operating system needs that. There are other things like PowerShell, whether it's a system that uses it or an admin that uses it for scripting. But long story short, bad guys will figure out a way to circumvent security controls you have that are looking for the deployment or installation of bad guy tools. They'll get through that filter, that gate, by using tools that are native to the systems that they're attacking in order to facilitate their attack.
So there was this story in the book. You talked about a Seattle logistics firm. It was hit by a Conti ransomware variant. It was saying it infected 60% of the firm's servers, and it was the same thing where they somehow used the administrators, their administrative tools against them.
So Windows management and PowerShell, very powerful at deploying the code or malware across an environment, and especially if it's the admin or a service running as an admin. I remember years ago we responded to an incident where it was actually the security tool that was running a service with administrative privileges that was compromised by a bad guy. And they used the security tool as itself, the service that was running to spread the malware across the environment.
So, Mike, just a clarification. When you say living off the land, is it specifically just taking whatever tools are in an environment and using that in order to propagate your attack or to execute your attack? Or is it also, for instance, the resources, as an example, someone might have had some virtual machines sitting around that they sort of forgot about from an inventory perspective, or other things that might be deployed in a company that they're no longer tracking, doesn't get the latest security patches, those sort of things that they then start to think about when you talk about land.
It would definitely escalate to that if they have the time to identify those. But traditionally, living off the land is services or applications resident on the machines they're attacking or using to attack. Now, if as a bad guy they find this target host with all these goodies on it, but then they realize, well, this is the admin's computer, so if I do stuff from this computer, they may notice some latency or resource drain. So maybe they do some recon first, or they figure out a way to stand up a virtual machine in that environment, ideally using a dormant one instead of setting off some potential bells about creating a new one. But then migrate those tools or figure out if there's a way to employ those tools on that virtual machine that's not being used. That would be a pretty good tactic.
Yeah, it comes from the term, for those of us that have been lived in either a suburb or urban environment our entire life, the concept of living off the land is that you're going to literally live off of what is available. That this term is an old term. It doesn't have anything to do, or that originally didn't have anything to do with the world of computers. The idea is you're going to live somewhere and you're going to use what is available on that, that property in order to survive. And so I think that's a perfect term. Think of like an episode of Survivor, basically, right? You're only allowed to use what's there, right? And so that's why, they call this a living off the land, because you're going to you meaning the attacker is going to use whatever tools are available to them. And why, what's the purpose of that, Mike? Meaning that, why don't I want to, let's say I've got this great tool that does this amazing thing. Why wouldn't I, if I've got access to the environment, why wouldn't I just install this great tool that I have that does this cool thing? Why would I do this living off land?
So there's a couple of layers of, hopefully a couple of layers that organizations have in place. One of those is monitoring incoming payloads. So a file type, and I guess that's the other part. How would you get that payload into the environment? Is that an attachment to a phishing email? Is it compromised credentials? In either case, payloads usually have a good amount of baggage with them. It's not it's not kilobytes. It's usually megabytes, and sometimes multiple 100, 400 megabytes of size, depending. So the first layer is, or the first hurdle is, how do I get it into the environment? The second one is, how do I get past all the filters, whether that's antivirus, malware, spam filter, et cetera, that's not going to strip that attachment or that payload out of the communication. And then the last part of that is, a lot of times, ideally, we would limit a user's ability to install something on an endpoint to a privileged account. So if you compromise the receptionist, she shouldn't be a local admin. So she shouldn't be able to, that account shouldn't be able to install stuff locally, that payload. So if you can craft your attack utilizing tools that are resident, you're simply connecting to the machine and running that stuff that's already installed, and you're running it locally. The other benefit of running it locally is that a lot of times those services are already installed and using administrative privileges.
Is it also true though, Mike, that I know you talked about how do you get the malware in, or whatever the package is, into the environment, but like from an attacker's perspective, once they've sort of, like you mentioned PowerShell earlier, right? Once they sort of have a methodology to propagate the attack, to actually live off the land, that's something they can then replicate in other companies, organizations, and not just limit it to like one company, correct?
Right. Yeah. So fundamentally, Windows environments work the same. There are, some of the older ones have a few antiquated services and methods for communicating that are probably still enabled versus today's. I think there's a lot more network segmentation and some other things that are more common today than there used to be. But for sure, if you can build an attack strategy in a Windows environment, you should be able to replicate that to some degree, just about in any Windows network.
When you were talking about the hurdles, would another hurdle be, even if you've got, you managed to download the file, you managed to get past the filters, would there be additional filters required to actually execute this tool? If you're talking
Yes.
about some,
A lot of environments would require administrative privileges in order to execute. So as an example, a normal user might not be able to run registry editor or even a command prompt, or even change their desktop, wallpaper. And so, after you install it, you've also got to figure out, what privileges do you need to run it.
Now I remember what I forgot. You brought up a topic a couple of times, and it's outside of the scope of what I wanted to talk about today, but I thought we'd just talk about it a little bit. And that is this concept of not allowing regular users to have admin on their own machines. I know that is best practice. The question is it common practice?
Which way? That they do have admin practice?
That they do not have that. I know that it's best practice not to give Joe Schmo, that shouldn't have admin even on his local machine, even though that is, inconvenient to him. We often talk about that security is inconvenient, right? So even though that's inconvenient, it's also inconvenient to the IT people, because now anytime Joe Schmo needs a new tool, we have to be the one to go install it, which sounds amazing in terms of security, but it also sounds like a giant pain in the butt. How
It
common
depends.
is it that people actually do this?
How common it is difficult, but I can tell you in regulated organizations, those that have to be compliant with something, there is a control check for making sure that local, users don't have, more privileges than they need. Well, then organizations get around that by justifying the need for a user to have, admin privileges, and I see that even in well, mature in secure environments. An engineer has local admin because he needs to run, some kind of CAD software with, the ability to manipulate memory and, graphics and all this other stuff. Thinking, well, that's justified. Well, bad guys realize this too. So those are the users they're going to target. They're not going to target the receptionist, for the most part. So it depends. In smaller organizations where, the IT, support doesn't want to have to answer the call to help someone install, a widget, they would much rather just give them the ability to do that and not have to take so many phone calls. But in larger organizations, that leads to what we call shadow IT. The ability to download and do stuff and make changes and build things without IT being involved. Well, that lends itself to more issues down the road with patch management and conflict and vulnerabilities and other things that IT doesn't know about because they weren't involved with helping you do those things. And so, restricting access and privilege is necessary in a large user environment for a lot of reasons.
Prasanna,
But security is one of those.
Prasanna, you remember the episode "The Wi-Fi is Down"?
Yep,
One of
I
our
remember
OG
that.
episodes, and that particular person said that they had, what was it, 450 SaaS applications?
SaaS applications. Yeah.
That just blew me away when they said that.
So, Mike, this is all like amazing, just learning about living off the land attacks. How come it isn't talked about more often? Like, it seems that this would be very common for a lot of the attack vectors and what bad guys are doing. But like Curtis, like you mentioned at the start of this, right? It's something you had really heard about.
So it's not the sexy part of the attack, right? So when you're telling a story,
Wait,
that's
there's
the
a
part where
sexy
people
part of the
start to-
attack?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
That's the part of the story where people's eyes kind of gloss over because it gets pretty technical and it's not as exciting as, they broke in and then they made off with all the goods. And all that stuff in the middle, people just kind of get blurry about because it's not the cause or the effect. It's the creamy filling. Although that excites me sometimes, but
if I could make an analogy, there was recently this huge heist at the Louvre, right? Where the guys, and like, I'm drawing an analogy where like the living off the land was like the yellow vests, like they just pretended to be part of the crew. And so people they did, it wasn't the sexy part of the attack that they managed to just sort of look like they belonged there and just sort of get in and out in the middle of broad daylight and steal the crown jewels.
there are so many ties to the kinetic world with cyber, all those analogies. And I've done social engineering and red teaming and breaking into buildings for years. And all of that stuff is very similar. As soon as I make it in a door into a building, the first thing I target is the break room and I get a cup of coffee because somebody that's walking around with coffee is less suspicious than someone that's wandering around aimlessly. And then, if you've got a clipboard or a name badge or a notepad or whatever, I can tell you, I started breaking into buildings upon request, not illicitly.
We understand.
Man, 2004. So 22 years. And never once has anybody stopped and asked me if I needed help. or who are you here to see, or who are you, or nothing.
Right.
22 years. People don't want to talk to me. That's fine. But that's helped me be successful at social engineering.
By the way, I
And
love it when you use fancy words like the kinetic world. I've never heard anyone call it the kinetic world before. You mean like the real world?
the
As
real
opposed
world,
to the
where things
cyber world?
right, and you can touch stuff. Yeah.
Okay. I've literally never heard the term kinetic. I know the term kinetic.
Where does a matrix fall then?
What's that?
Where does a
That's
matrix fall then?
That's the virtual.
Well, so there's the kinetic matrix of things that supports the cyber, and I guess you could do analog and digital too, but yeah.
All right. I had
The
to call that out.
Nebuchadnezzar is in the kinetic world.
Yes.
What's that?
The Nebuchadnezzar, the ship in the Matrix.
Right. It's in the kinetic world. Exactly. Nice, deep reference there. So so this is about we're in the environment, right? But basically, we want to spread around. We want to do stuff without being attacked, and without being detected. And so the best way to do that is to use tools that, again, aren't being monitored because they're just part of the normal way of doing business. Does that sound about right?
So then,
And you're right. And those tools can facilitate the different phases of an attack. So sometimes, those tools are used to do reconnaissance, and, the low and slow stuff, the stealthy stuff, because you don't want to get caught before you're able to really, kick up your attack. So you do the reconnaissance stuff really quietly, and then you use those tools to pull down the other parts of your attack. So maybe you've got payloads or additional software like Mimikatz as an example for credential harvesting and that kind of stuff. So you would go slow and methodical first, and then once you figured out what you need to do next, or what the environment looks like, you start to do more. You're more active and you take more risk, and that's where you would evolve your attack into different tools.
Mike, what role does the level of credentials play in this? If you're doing a living off the land attack, what role does the level of credentials that you're using play?
Man, what do I always say? It depends, right? So
you know what? I'm just going to cut every time you ever say it depends, and I'm going to make a super cut, and it'll be a 4-hour-long video. But go ahead, Mike.
Somebody did a meme where they took all the ums. Oh, it was our intern program. So the interns were doing a presentation, and we give them constructive feedback, and they were using the filler words, the ums and so somebody on one of the other interns did a compilation of all the ums and uhs. Wow. And so it was just a consistent
So your answer is it depends.
So it does depend. And what I mean by that is it depends on the capabilities in the environment to monitor for weird stuff. So it would be weird for the receptionist to run PowerShell in an environment, unless she's also a computer science student or something like that. It would not be weird for an admin to be running these administratively related tools or scripts or activities. So in the cyber world, we have tools that do what are called user behavior. I'll get it right in a second. User and event behavior analytics, or UEBA. So it creates a baseline. So type of user, type of device, and it tries to delineate between what's normal and these anomalies. So if you've got even an admin account that doesn't use PowerShell very often, if a bad guy compromises that environment and that admin account, now he's running PowerShell in some weird way, that could be flagged or should be flagged. But it depends on the capabilities in that environment. Now, Windows inherently, you can set up logging and alerting, but a lot of organizations don't. They don't want to spend the time. It's noisy because Windows environments talk a lot. And then even if there is an alert, that one or two or a few IT people are busy putting out fires, and it's going to be a day or a week before they go, hey, there was this alert thing that I need to look into. So it's a mess. But yeah, there are ways of identifying weird stuff based on the type of user that's conducting that activity.
So I know you talked about monitoring, alerting, Mike. Are there other things that an organization can do? Because with these living off the land attacks, it's already there. Like all the tools are there that this person needs. And so are you basically saying you're screwed if you're trying to protect these things and prevent these sort of attacks from using the tools that already exist?
It
You're not.
depends.
And it's just how much overhead do you want to put on securing your environment? One of the things, just taking you back to another example of a resource that's available 24/7 that shouldn't be. And I'm alluding to, some of these administrative tools being available all the time, even if the administrator doesn't need it, is remote access into your network from supporting vendors. Why is that available 24 hours a day if I don't currently need your help? It's because someone's too lazy to go turn off the modem. And yeah, I said modem. Or disable that VPN access or suspend that user account because it creates overhead. Very similarly, we can suspend services running in our environment. We can turn off administrative services that aren't being used when they're not necessary, but we don't do that. And then ideally, because we don't do that, you would want to monitor for the use of those things. And a lot of organizations still think that we don't need that, or it's too expensive, or, we don't have the skill set, whatever the case is. There's excuses after excuses.
Yeah, I think this, we've talked about this, and we're going to give a couple action items here. We've talked about, like, one of the things that comes up a lot is RDP, right? And that RDP is very, very useful, but RDP open all the time, and RDP, especially RDP accessible via the internet, right? Directly accessible via the internet is just, it's just sort of like asking for trouble, right? And so there are ways to turn it off and turn it on when you need it. And there's also, and again, you alluded to, there's a budget aspect of this, right? So there are remote access tools that are much more secure than RDP that you could enact. It's going to increase your cost, but perhaps increase your costs a little bit with a much higher level of security. I think it's a matter of, like, finding that sweet spot, right? Where's some things I think we can do where there's a little bit of hassle. And I'll give another perfect example of something that you suggested back on a previous podcast that I enacted in my personal life. And that was using, the idea was that don't have, when you go into your bank, like, don't have a bunch of other tabs open and all that kind of stuff. And the way I decided to implement that was, if I do anything that's that level of security, I do it in a different browser, right? Meaning a different brand of browser, right? And then and since I use Chrome as, like, my main browser, I implemented there's a tool that allows me to blacklist certain sites, right? Like Citibank, right? I can say, if I ever, because I don't know if you know this, Mike, I forget stuff. So I got CRS like a lot, and I forget that I told myself I'm not going to log into Citibank on my Chrome browser. And so I do it. I'll type in city.com, and Chrome will say, you told us not to let you do that. And I'm like, oh yeah. And then I go over to Firefox. Minor level of inconvenience for a significant change in security. And I think it's a matter of finding those things for these living off the land attacks. Does that sound about right?
It does. And if I could continue your bank analogy a little further, so your browser would be the living off the land part, especially if you save your password.
Yeah.
So that guy just has to compromise your machine and identify the browsers you use, and then trial and error. Chrome doesn't work. Oh, Firefox does work. Oh, and you saved your password. So now I'm in your bank because I've used the resources available to me on your machine. Well, then the evolution of that activity would generate, some kind of log or event triggers in the bank, right? So somebody logged in at 2 a.m. from a different IP address than, your recent IP addresses. There should be an email or a text message potentially related to that. Well, then if they buy stuff or change stuff, you should hopefully have alerting or events related to that. And if there's any transactions over a certain threshold, you should have alerting related to those things.
Right.
So those are the things that, and just going back to the living off the land part, bad guys are going to do reconnaissance first and be quiet. But then when they're ready to execute their plan, they're not necessarily as concerned with how loud they're going to be, because it's going to happen very quickly.
Nice.
How?
Go ahead, Prasanna.
So, Mike, I know you said that people will act fast. How much time is taken usually in that first step of kind of scoping things out using living off the land versus, okay, now I'm actually going to execute and sort of run with it? And like you said, they don't care how loud it is. They're going to make a bunch of noise, break a bunch of things, but they're trying to go as quickly as possible before they're detected.
If I could write "it depends" backwards so that it would show up the right way, I would. But it depends.
Is it like 90% of the time is typically spent in the first phase and less time is spent in the second? Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, there are some good statistics around that. But yeah, as an example, an attack that could last 4 hours had probably 30 to 90 days worth of reconnaissance ahead of it.
So yeah, that's interesting. All right, well, let's talk about, PowerShell has come up a lot. What can we do with PowerShell? And, is there anything that's like the easy idea that I talked about earlier? Is there a way to easily disable and re-enable PowerShell when we need it?
So of all the environments that I've worked with or in, very few of them use PowerShell very much. There's usually that one admin, that one person that knows how to use it and that uses it because they get it, and man, it makes life easy. Everybody else doesn't need it. And in a lot of cases, PowerShell is not necessarily required or needed across an entire environment.
Mm-hmm.
You might just need it between your admin machine and Office 365 or or your server cluster. Take it off of everything else. And that goes back to hardening. So how do I harden my network? Well, you first got to understand your network, right? Know yourself. What am I responsible for? How do all these things work? What is their primary role? Hopefully you've got one machine for one role. We would call that a bastion host. Like your web server is just your web server.
Mm-hmm.
It's not also your financial server or your backup server. And then for those roles and the purpose of that machine, assess what's needed, what's necessary to support it. Like you don't need Bluetooth active on a production server. It doesn't need to be a web server unless it's a web server. You don't need, it doesn't need print server services running. So those are just examples of the services running. Well, now let's look at all the overhead from a file and help, software perspective. Your server doesn't need Microsoft Solitaire and games. It doesn't need doesn't need all the help files. It doesn't need templates and all of the pre-installed, garbage that the vendor, whether it's Dell or whoever, there's so much that can be done to make a machine run more effectively and securely if you can really understand what it's going to do and then take everything else off. Turn it off.
But Mike, that takes work.
It takes work. So again, it depends. So if I've got all these machines and I spend the time to develop what I would call a golden image, right? So I take one machine and I say, this is exactly how I want this done. Well, create an image of that and apply it on the other, however many. And then for each one of those golden images, I can add back on top of that base golden image, the things that are particular to that server.
So your golden image is like in this case, PowerShell is disabled everywhere, but then for that one person who needs PowerShell, you can turn it on.
Correct. And that's great too, because if you have an issue with that machine, just reapply the image. Start from scratch without having to figure out what broke and how to fix it.
Is there a way for us to figure out the tools, if we're trying to secure things for, against a living off the land attack? Is there a way to figure out the tools like PowerShell that are in use in our environment by the use of by looking at like the ports that they're using, for example?
There are, and there's free tools. One's called Nmap, another one's called Wireshark. So those are network protocol analyzers. And so you can run that across your environment. It'll tell you by IP address, here's the ports that are open. And based on the default service for a given port, it'll give you a description of what it thinks might be running on that port. But bad guys are also pretty good at changing what ports are being used so that you're not suspicious of network activity. Like we had an incident call on Friday where a school district said, I think I'm getting hacked. I just shut my network down. All right, well, let's look into that. Well, it was expired certificates for a website. And then on the back end, the logs showed that data was going out. ICMP data was going out to this AWS IP address. Well, ICMP by itself, not a bad thing, but to an IP address that maybe doesn't have a good reputation, that could be a bad guy just sending, like intentionally changing what port they're sending data out so that it looks like ICMP, but maybe it's just low throttle, throttled down data exfiltration. It turned out to be a false positive. It was actually their web filter for the school district. But we helped them learn something new that day. But bad guys do that. Our engineers will exfil credentials over the DNS port because you can't block DNS and hardly anybody's monitoring that port. Right. So if you just do it slow and methodically, then you could exfil quite a bit of data over a period of time.
Yeah, I think we talked about that when we had what's his name, Dwayne Persona, the red teamer. Yeah, when we had the red teamer on there, he talked a lot about the use of DNS. You gave me a memory back when my daughter was young, and I was a little concerned about some of the traffic that I was seeing coming into the computer she was using. And I went and I bought a SonicWall firewall, right, that had content filtering. And she came in the front. It was literally there was a box, a SonicWall box sitting on the couch. She walked in, she goes, SonicWall, what's that doing here? I said, well, yeah, it's for this. She's like, they use that at the school. It won't let you do anything. And I'm like, yes. I was like, I bought the right one. Anyway, so something you talked about with this idea that it was going to a place that isn't quite trusted. That brings up another concept of this idea of either application whitelisting or IP address whitelisting in terms of, is that another way that we can, and it's another tool where it's, when you start, it's probably going to be a giant pain, right? If you say no applications are allowed to be used except for those that have been blessed by IT, it's going to really suck for a while. But is that, again, this goes back to the turning off admin. Is this a common practice as well?
It is. And if you put the work in up front, it's going to be a little less headache. What I mean by that is if you want to implement, kind of whitelisting, blacklisting policies, start with getting to know everybody. Like go sit with the engineers, go sit with the accounting and executives and find out what they're using, or do some of your own homework. There's logs out there, but go talk to them about what you want to do and the purpose. Like we're doing this to make things safer, but it also helps us reduce risk and problems with computers and, all that good stuff. So help me understand what you need to do your job. And then I'm going to use that to develop a plan to make us all safe and better running and environment and computers with fewer problems.
So you really have to do that research up front where you're looking at the things that are being used. And again, you can use a network monitoring tool to do that. These are the things that are happening. What's that?
I've got another example of that. And how you do this, and by this I mean this exercise of understanding what your business needs or what your employees need to do their job. A lot of times it just nobody spends time on an exercise like that until there's smoke or fire, right? And then we're like, well, what caused it? Why did this happen? How did you let this get this bad? That kind of thing. And really, if you really understand security, and whether that's physical security or cyber, it's got to start with understanding what you're protecting and how this whole place works. A good example of that would be a school district. Schools in Texas primarily don't care to have network connections to China, unless you've got like some sister school and there's a program over there and this kind of thing. For the most part, we don't communicate with China, a public school in Texas. So why are we allowing traffic from China to even reach our network? And so there's that. All right. Well, then a bigger, kind of more interesting story is I had a friend that worked for Match.com as their IT security person, and they didn't do any geo IP blocking at the firewall, and they were getting hit millions of times a day from overseas. And a lot of those intent was to create fake female profiles in the application for the only purpose of phishing personal email addresses out of the male members of Match.com, so that they could then spam those male members' personal emails with pornography links. And those bad guys were making millions of dollars a day through phished pornography link clicks because of bots on the dating site that were coming from overseas. And the moment, I'll tell you how bad this was. The moment that they implemented geo IP blocking at Match.com, my friend got 1%. Well, from an organized crime perspective, this is how bad it was. They were just kind of an introverted kind of nobody. They just did their job and went home and played Xbox, that kind of thing. And one day they went home after having implemented geo IP blocking. It had such an impact on the organized crime ring that was running this thing. They had actually shipped a wooden casket, and it was propped up on their front porch that told them to undo the geo IP blocking.
Wow.
That doesn't sound. That's the dark side, So, all right. Well, we could talk about this all day, but I think we get, identify things that you need to, that your organization needs to get the job done, places that your organization needs to communicate with to get the job done, investigate all that stuff, and then start investigating locking things down, right? Turning off applications that aren't being used, turning off regions that we have no reason communicating with, and consider application whitelisting, and no administrative privileges on machines, right? Unless that person needs. And I'll tell one final story about this. Going back 100 years, when I was consulting at a certain communication company, and we had determined, or I had figured out that all their engineering team had admin root on their Unix workstations. And I talked to the boss. I was like, there is no reason that they need root on their workstations. And so I went around and I changed the root password. Each of them had let's say the user ID was Curtis. There was a user ID called Curtis0 that had a UID of 0, which was basically root. And they had that password. And I went around and I removed that entry and I rebooted the machine, right? And one of the guys was really, really angry. And he was like, well, when you reboot the machine, like the license manager doesn't come back up. And I go, well, if the license manager needs to come back up when you reboot the machine, why don't you just put it in the startup file so that it reboots or so it restarts when they reboot the machine? He says, I don't know how to do that. And that, sir, is why you don't have root.
And I actually like your story about the Unix environment, because you can take away people's, and I will also promote this. Even if you're an admin, don't run your machine as admin.
Right.
Run your machine as a normal user, and then elect to run applications as admin. You just have to put your credentials in every time.
Right.
But that'll save you. So similar to the Unix environment, you run as a normal user, and then you sudo to root when you need to use, and that also creates a log, an audit log of, because if everybody's using Curtis 0, then there's no accountability for who did what. It just says Curtis 0.
That was actually my nickname in high school, Curtis 0. Anyway. All right. Well, thank you very much, Mike. And everyone, thank you, Persona, again.
This was good.
Yeah. All right. That is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.